Started. Gracious Heavenly Father, we give thanks again this evening for the time you give to us to come together and talk through these subjects and work through the various things going on in the world. And so, God, we pray that you would be an encouragement to us, that you would strengthen our faith and our understanding of how you have made things. And in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Well, tonight we're going to be talking about transgenderism. And of course, transgenderism is kind of a catch-all for lots of different things going on in society today. And of course, transgenderism has to be distinguished from all of the other letters in the alphabet. The T kind of controls, in a lot of ways, the conversation right now. One of the interesting things that's happening in the world is the way the L's and the feminists are at war against the T's. And you wouldn't necessarily think of that being a fault line in the culture war, but when you start thinking about what transgenderism says and what it represents and what it does, it's as much an attack against women as it is against anything else. And so, one of the biggest examples of that, of course, is the way that a lot of the left and a lot of the supporters of the transgender movement have turned against J.K. Rowling, the author of the Harry Potter books. She has become quite outspoken in England against the transgender movement. And again, it's ironic because it's not like she's a conservative or a Christian or anything of the sort. Right? She's a hardcore, eighth wave feminist. But the reason is because she recognizes something about what transgenderism says about women as a sex. One of the things that transgenderism does on that front is that it ironically, expresses itself in traditional, female gender roles, which again is kind of an odd thing, right? When you think about the nature of that, So to start off tonight, I'm actually going to read from Deuteronomy chapter 22, beginning there at verse 5, because this is, again, one of the things we have to remind ourselves every now and then is that just because we live in 2025 doesn't mean that the world hasn't dealt with similar issues in the past. And so in the book of Deuteronomy, there is a verse in the midst of various miscellaneous laws that Moses is listing out for God's covenant people as they prepare to go into the promised land. And Deuteronomy 22 verse 5 says, "The woman shall not wear that which pertaineth unto a man, neither shall a man put on a woman's garment, for all that do so are abomination unto the Lord thy God." So when you read that verse, one of the things that you see there is that there is, at least according to the Bible, an understanding of an outward presentation of sex, right? Now, one of the things that transgenderism builds up on, and we'll talk about a little about this in a minute, is they make a differentiation between sex and gender, right? So when they talk about sex, what are they talking about? The chromosomes, right? XX, XY. Now, obviously, there are situations where there's XXY or just X or just Y, things like that. But of course, those are very few and far between, right? So when we're talking about sex, we're talking about XX and XY. And so what transgenderism does, one of the things it does, is that it says that gender is a cultural construct, right? So the ideas that we have of male and female are totally, again, kind of made up by the culture. And so to say that somebody is a woman is to say what? Right? That they're feminine, right? That they, what else do women do? Give birth, right? Yeah. When you think, Yeah, of a woman. Yeah, what else? What other kind of cultural constructs would you think of when it comes to being a woman?
You like their attire,
Right, their attire, right? Generally speaking, until about 20 years ago, what did women wear?
dresses.
Dresses, skirts, right? It's kind of interesting. How often do you see in kind of normal attire women wearing dresses and skirts nowadays?
Not often. Weddings, church weddings.
Yeah, I mean that's about it. Like formal attire is about the only time women wear dresses nowadays. And so when we think about that, right, we associate that with culture, right? Because back in the 1950s, right, if you were going to go to the store, how would a woman dress?
Dressed up. Hair down in curls. Dress.
You put on your finest to go to Belk's or whatever the department store was, right? You'd put on makeup, right, lipstick, all whole 9 yards, right?
And going to the doctor too. Now you see everything.
Right. People make fun of Walmart, but I've yet to be in any store that doesn't look like Walmart, where people are dressed in whatever they happen to throw on that morning, right? Right. Yeah, just kind of hoping things are covered. That's kind of the best bet, right? So when you think about gender, right, you think about things to identify with gender. Again, these things are kind of culturally malleable, right? So the transgender movement will say that when I tell you that a man is a man and a woman is a woman, well, I'm free to define those terms however I want, right? So you get in situations, right? Probably the most famous recently was with the Miss Ken. Oh goodness, Kenji Jackson, the Supreme Court justice. Remember when she was being interviewed by the Senate, right? One of the senators asked her, "What is a woman?" and what was her response? Remember, I'm not a biologist, is what she said. Right, she wouldn't give an answer, right? And when you think about that, right, we recognize kind of the absurdity of it. But when you understand again the nature of what the transgender movement is born out of, right? It's born out of this whole idea that words are defined by who?
Whatever they think it is.
Right. Well, you are the decider of what a word is. So if I want to call myself a woman, all right, do I necessarily need to define that?
Not now.
No, because again, I'm the one who decides that, right? So, there's certain outward things we associate with transgender movement, but at the base, it's really an argument about language, right? It's an argument about whether or not we can define words as they really and truly are. Now, when we think about that again from a Christian point of view, right, who defines what word means? What words mean? God does, right? So in Deuteronomy 22:5, when it says, the woman shall not wear that which pertaineth unto a man, all right, there are words there that have certain meanings, right? So a man is what? A person who has a XY chromosome, right? Again, we do not differentiate sex and gender. Those are words that mean the same thing to us, right? That's one of the reasons why it's somewhat important when Christians talk about these issues that we don't use gender language, because gender language is coded and so messed up by the transgender stuff that you're almost already playing their game when you talk about gender. So again, the Bible talks about sex in this way. So when you hear "woman shall not wear that which pertaineth unto a man," well, think about what that pictures again in God's law. All right. Back then, what did everybody wear in some sense? A dress, right? So when you think about it, it's not saying women can't wear pants, right? Now, there was certainly a point of view many years ago where that was the case, right? Um, if that was one of the big parts of the second wave of the feminist movement, right? Betty Friedan and all that stuff, right? What was her big, what was the big slogan, back in the early 60s? What were you supposed to burn, right? And what was that representing? Right? It wasn't saying that there was something necessarily evil about that piece of clothing, but it represented again this thing that was holding women back, right? That there was this piece of clothing again was representative of something that marked them out as different from a man, right? So you burn this piece of clothing as a sign of this kind of merging of male and female into one, right? So effectively, what second wave feminism does is it says, what is the perfect woman? It's a man, right? What women need to do is to, get out of the trap that is feminine gender roles, and they need to start doing everything a man does. They need to, and when I say that, what kind of things do you think of things that are necessarily manly that women need to be able to do too?
My oars.
Right. I mean, that's fundamentally one of the downstream effects. Right. We have this thing nowadays where women are allowed to serve in frontline infantry units, and and why is that even a problem? Can a woman do just anything a man can do?
No, we're not the same. God didn't intend for us to do the same thing.
That exactly. And I mean, that's what Deuteronomy 22:5 is getting to, right? It's getting to this idea that men and women are different from each other, right? We're physically different from each other. We're made differently. God has intended for us to serve differently, right? Again, go all the way back to Genesis chapter 2, right? What are the man and woman supposed to be? Right? And, the woman's supposed to be a helpmeet, but of course the man they're supposed to be compatible with each other, right? That's the problem Adam had with the animals in the garden, right? They weren't compatible with him, right? They didn't, what's the, kind of romantic way to say that, right? You complete me, right? But yeah, everybody feels sorry for Miss Brandy real quick. But again, there's this idea, again, complementing, right? That male and females are different from each other, and they complement each other. So when you get into a situation when you start denying, basic, sex differences, right? It leads to what we see in the transgender movement, where sex becomes, interchangeable, right? So men can become women, women can become men, men can just become, asexual, right? Non-binary is the new way of saying that. You just don't identify with any, sex or gender. And, you think about that. What's going on behind that, other than just mental illness? But what's going on back there when somebody says they're non-binary?
Just define God.
Well, I mean that's fundamentally what's behind all of it, right? Yeah, I say that in the handout, right? What the problem is Dr. Douglas Kelly likes to say they hate God, right? That's the problem. But the idea again is it goes back to the denial of God's right to create, and so God made you a woman, and God made me a man. I can say all day long that, that this is true and this is not true, but at the end of the day, there are certain cancers I get that you can't get, right? And there are certain cancers you get that I can't get. And does language change that reality? No, right? There was a famous episode of House back in, I guess it would have been 08, 09. The TV show House?
I never watched it.
No. There was a famous episode where this woman came into the ER and was sick, and they couldn't figure out what was wrong. Well, what House finally figured out is that she was a man and she had testicular cancer, but nobody thought to kind of look into that because, again, how she presented herself and things like that. And so, again, when we talk about these transgender types issues, right, one of the things that's very important to remember is, again, we're dealing with something different from homosexuality, right? We're dealing with something different than lesbianism, right? The G and the L in the alphabet, right? We're dealing with something much more fundamentally destructive, but also something more fundamentally radically anti-Christian than even the G and the L, because you're not just kind of attacking the natural use of the man or the natural use of the woman. You're really talking about anti-humanism, right? You're denying the very nature of the human being at that point. And so, again, to go back to Deuteronomy 22:5 for a second, again, when Moses is writing this, right, the woman should not wear that which pertaineth unto a man. Again, if you walked into the camp in Israel, would you immediately be able to tell from dress, who was a man, who was a woman? Not really. I mean, there may have been a sense in which, back in the day, what would women's clothing probably tend to have more of?
Layers, and then they would.
Yeah, more layers.
Maybe a head cover,
a head covering, right? That's certainly part of it. We'll get to that in a second. A head covering, and what other naturally do you think the women would care more about than the men when it comes to dress? Colors, right? So, yeah, and of course we see this, the opposite in the animal kingdom, interestingly enough, right? Because, if you have two birds, which one's the one with all the flowers and the pizzazz and all that? Right? The men, right? And what are the women? Camouflage, drab, right? My favorite example is the cardinal. The male cardinal is just blood red and a peacock, yeah. And so you again, the purpose there obviously is mating and all that. But generally speaking, you may have been able to tell the difference in that way. So Moses is getting at something much deeper than simply what we used to call what did we used to call men who dressed up like women?
Drag queens.
Well, drag queens, but transvestites, right? That was the old word, right? We don't use that word anymore because that implies something fundamentally different from transgenderism, right? A transvestite was just somebody who dressed up in women's clothes. They were still, somebody who dressed up in that way, was not necessarily attracted to men, right? Again, there was just something about the wearing of women's clothing that, did whatever. So when we think about, again, the clothing aspect of what Moses is talking about, again, we're talking about something deeper than simply the outward materials that people are wearing, right? We're talking about roles. We're talking about place in society. We're talking about purpose. We're talking about things of that nature, right? And again, that's one of the things that transgenderism develops, but it also promotes, right? Because you think about one of the things in the military, for example, to go back to that, right? One of the things that's happened in the military in the last 10 years is one of the things they've gotten rid of is distinctive male and female uniforms. It used to be the case that men and women, were very distinctive in their uniforms. The female uniforms. What do you think they kind of took on the visage of?
The dresses and skirts.
Right, skirts. Right, they're much more feminine in their cut. Right, in the shape. In the headgear. Right, one of the when I was in the Marines, the women's headgear looked more like bonnets. Right, they were kind of. I mean, I don't know anything about this, but they were round, right, and they had a very small bill, and they kind of had a neat little tassel on the front. Much more again, female coded, where the men's headgear was very masculine, right? It was very, had very hard edges. It was direct, kind of almost sat on your head so that it was kind of forward moving. The women's covers kind of sat back a little bit, kind of more almost like a defensive posture. And you think about, again, what is that communicating? Just that little bit of difference in head covering. That the men are out front and the women are in the back, right? The women are in support roles, right? They're nurses, administrative staff, things of that nature, right? Because and why did we just naturally think that's the way things should be ordered in the military?
There's a physical difference.
Right. Well, sure, the physical difference certainly plays a lot to it.
It's different roles in life in general.
Right, because what's again, kind of just using military parlance. What's the man's responsibility? Defend and protect, right? What's the woman's responsibility? Nurture, right. So you put that in a military context, it makes sense, right? Well, what's the main role then for females in the military? Support. So, like I said, administrative stuff, right? Getting all the paperwork ready to go so you can, get paid to kill people, right? To do the nursing stuff, right? That was, what was the lady's name who got famous during the war? Florence Nightingale, and she kind of invented in a lot of ways the Red Cross and things like that, and all that kind of stuff. So transgenderism, right? It presents itself in a very one of the things about transgenderism, right, is that it's naturally very masculine, and the reason for that is because the reason why it's in our faces all the time is because that's a male move, right? To be direct, to be offensive, in kind of both senses of that. What was you think about the drag queens and stuff. One of the things about the drag queens is, what do you notice about their makeup and about their dress?
It's exaggerated. It's over the top.
Right, over the top. It's exaggerated. Right, it's meant to draw attention, and it's also, what else do you think that's meant to do? Right, it's provocative. It's look like a man in makeup, right? Because yes, well, and again, you don't need a degree in sociology to figure out what's going on there, right? And also, again, it's not a big surprise to find out, two things about, especially that group of, the transgender movement. What are two things you think is very native to that group?
Sexual abuse.
Right, sexual abuse on both ends, right? They themselves were sexually abused, and they're sexual abusers, right? I mean, that it almost goes hand in hand, right? Because one of the things that often happens when you are affected in that way is, what then is your view of kind of natural relations? It's warped, right? And so it becomes very exaggerated, right? It becomes very, just kind of messed up, right? And so, that's one of the reasons why, even in the transgender movement, which group do you think is of a higher number? In other words, are more men transitioning to become women, or are more women transitioning to become men? Yes, it's not even close, right? And you think about it. Why do you think that is? Who does the Bible describe as having far more issues with the seventh commandment? Men, right? And you think about, I mean, and again, it's just biology, right? It's natural order of things, right? Going back generations, who died more often at a young age, right? And so, who had to make sure the generations continued as fast as they possibly could?
Women.
Men, right? Because they were getting ready to get killed more, so they need to hurry up and sow their oats, as it were. And so they just naturally became much more aggressive in that. And so one of the things about the Christian faith, one of the effects of the Christian faith has culturally, going back all the way to the first century, is that one of the effects the Christian faith has on a society is, who do you think gets under control in a Christian society? Men. Because women are have a tendency to be more protected in a Christian society because the men are under control, right? Because the men are the ones who are wild and need the discipline, need the the kind of corralling of natural spirits that only grace and mercy and love and the forgiveness of sins can do. So, one of the things that happened in Rome, for instance, is that, again, Paul, when he's talking about arsenokoitai and talking about all the, wicked perversions that are happening in Rome, right? One of the things that happens as the Christian faith spreads throughout the Roman Empire is, one of the first things to go away is man-boy relationships, right? Those were very common in the Mediterranean in the first century, right? Men, having relations with young boys, if you listen to my buddies who were in Iraq and Afghanistan, that's still a huge problem in the Middle East and in South Asia. Older men and young boys. That's a huge issue in those cultures. If you went up to a random person who's engaged in that stuff in Afghanistan, for example, and called them a pedophile or something, right? They would have the categories to understand what you're talking about, right? Because they don't see anything perverted about it. That's just, again, natural to culture. So one of the reasons why the transgender movement is so coded towards males is because males got something wrong up here when it comes to the seventh commandment. And so one of the things that society or that social movement does is it promotes and provides opportunity for all numbers of wickedness in that regard. And so, and why do you think also that there's less of the transition? Now, something's happened here recently to change this a little bit, but why do you think it's less that women transitioning to men?
I think women can be more masculine without having to.
Yeah, there's an acceptance of quote unquote tomboyism today than there used to be. I certainly knew people growing up whose grandmothers forced them to wear skirts and makeup and things like that. And not anybody in this room right now. And things like that, right? There was less acceptance of that kind of thing back in the day. But did any of those tomboys ever think about, well, maybe I'm really a man? No, right? That wasn't really a thing. But it's starting to rise because what do you see happening now? You see, counselors in schools and stuff, right? Taking what we would have assumed to be either effeminate men or masculine women, and what are they telling them in the public schools?
They're confused. They assume that they are.
Mm-hmm.
Just because you take something and you might have a boy who's on the creative side, the artsy side.
Mm-hmm.
And then you might have a girl who is into
athletics. Right.
And you see that
right.
they're not fitting.
Yeah. Which is ironic, right? Because, modern culture says that there are no genders, right? There are no, all this stuff is a social construct. But what are they trying to do? Change it into, and again, it's interesting. If you're going to transition from being a male or female, right? Nobody's transitioning to be a tomboy, right? What are they transitioning to? Kind of stereotypes. Exaggerated stereotypes of what a feminine woman is, right? So they wear, foot high heels, and they wear of course they don't know how to do it right, so it's all, kind of, and of course they don't have the cheekbones and they don't have the facial structure for it, right? At least to do it correctly. So it's kind of naturally unnatural because you don't really design. My face is not designed for rouge and things of that nature, right?
You're just naturally rosy cheeks.
But it's amazing how even in babies you can see, you just knows like a baby is a little boy, just something about the facial.
Oh,
yeah.
Little girl. Yeah.
And even in animals, I can even see and tell if it's just looking at the face of a kitty cat. Sometimes you can say, oh, that looks, more of I don't know. It's just
the only thing that really changes some of this calculus is there's a book, and I meant to bring it with me because I was at the house, about the explosion of transgenderism in young women in the past 10 years. And really what it is a social contagion, right? There's I'll have to bring it because I can't remember what the name of it is right now. But I just read it a couple years ago. But this used to be almost exactly how I presented it. Far more men turning into women than women turning into men. But in the last 10 years, there's been a massive rise among young prepubescent women being talked into the fact that they're boys, and what kind of surgeries are they getting?
Mutilation.
It's mutilation, right?
But then they're regretting it.
Well, there's a huge movement of that too, and a lot of it, of course, who is it driven by? Is it driven by dad or is it driven by mom? Mom, right? And why do you think moms are pushing their young girls towards that? I mean, obviously the answer is wickedness because they hate God, but
There could be an Oedipus complex or
well,
a societal status.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is societal status. I mean, you see this in Hollywood, right? How many Hollywood actresses and actors now have transgender children?
Lots.
Yeah. Do you think it's because there's been this grand awakening, or is it because, well, this is
accept it. They think it's great.
Right? And so, if you don't have a transgender child, what does that say about you?
Yeah, there's something wrong with you.
Right. You must. So you do this to your children, right? And what's the medical term for that? Where moms will make their children sick. Munchausen syndrome, right? They used to be one of those things that only showed up on like the doctor shows on TV, but they're starting to see a lot of that. And it's not just with transgenderism, it's with other things. My sister tells me that they run into that every now and then, where moms will do things to their children. And so, because what comes with that kind of thing? Sympathy, support, attention, right?
I was just noticing too, I was looking through some doctors in Charlotte, and you used to never see, doctors that are specifically just have a practice for the transgenderism to tend to those patients. And I was just amazed at how many are now.
Oh yeah, openly advertising,
practice. And it wasn't just one; it was a
right.
number of practices.
Well, and that's
all they treat is the transgenderism.
Yeah, and I mean, and why are doctors doing it?
Money.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of money to be made in that. Do you think that kind of stuff is covered by Blue Cross Blue Shield?
Probably is now.
Well, it might be now, but so And so who can afford that kind of stuff?
Well,
People of means, and people for whom societal position means a lot, right? So that's another thing about this issue. Do you think transgenderism is a huge problem in Rwanda?
No.
I didn't think so.
Yeah, I think it's a big problem in you know uh, Ecuador. No. Why is this a huge problem in Western Europe and America and Canada?
Lost our minds. There's no Christianity. There's no
Mm-hmm.
God-fearing people.
Yeah, I mean that's a lot of it. Certainly, part of it is that.
It's accepted.
Well, I mean,
It's praised. It's more than
Yeah.
accepted. It's promoted.
yeah. I mean, one of the things too is you see this in the Northern Kingdom, in First and Second Kings, is that with prosperity and leisure comes all kinds of dangers, right? We live in a society now where how much work do you have to do every day to feed yourself?
Not much.
So what does that give you? A lot of time to worry about things that
Go down rabbit holes.
and create things that don't exist, right?
Let me ask this. Back, I'll use World War II for example. Back when all the guys was all fighting and the women had to take over manufacturing.
Oh yeah, manufacturing stuff, yeah.
Farming and what have you. So
Right.
You think that changed a lot?
Well, I think it. I mean, there's been studies that show it did. That World War II had a very interesting effect on gender or sex roles in the United States because, like you said, I mean, it wasn't just Rosie the Riveter and stuff like that. But one of my favorite movies, if I can admit this, from the mid '90s, with Tom Hanks and Rosie O'Donnell and Madonna,
A League of Their Own.
League of Their Own.
There's no crime in baseball.
What was it
The
the female baseball
League of
leagues?
Their Own.
Yeah, well I know that's the name of the movie. I was trying to think of the name of the league, but things like that, opened a door that they didn't realize they were opening at the time. I mean, it's not like it's not saying a woman operating a rivet gun is necessarily against the Bible, right? That's not obviously a question.
This kind of totally different than that though, because at the same time, those were created to give people outlets and
Right.
entertainment and still have some type of lifestyle.
Yeah.
These people that are doing the transgender stuff is because they can't win against people. Like boys can't win against boys. So they need to be a winner.
Oh
So
yeah,
they
the
go
sports
with
thing,
a girl.
yeah, the sports
It's
thing
the
is
same thing,
is
even
just
accepted,
yeah.
Like they win by 5 hours on some kind of
Yeah,
Yeah.
even if they're more feminine, they're
Yeah.
accepted among the girls more than they are the men.
Right.
So you be a girl so you can go, have cheese and wine instead of hang out and do
Right.
whatever.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
But then those boy athletes that are those female athletes never transition to being a girl. If you identify as a girl and you're a boy, you're doing it for a wrong reason in the sense of athletics.
Well, I mean, that's all. Well, see, a lot of the athlete stuff is purely attention.
But I think it's
Yeah.
even parental. I think parents want their kids to be the winner.
Oh,
and
yeah.
That's what it takes.
Yeah.
Like,
Well, I mean, yeah, a lot of it goes back, yeah.
If you're not good enough to beat your own gender, don't come down to.
I mean, yeah, a lot of it again is driven. I mean, that's kind of one of the things going on in our culture, and has been for probably the last 30 years, is the infantilization of adulthood, and also the way that adults don't grow up, and on the medical side, right? You're talking about Munchausen by proxy, but when we see this all the time in sports, parents living through their children, right? Parents who either weren't good enough themselves, or the movie Napoleon Dynamite, Uncle Rico, these men especially who have these wild fantasies about their own abilities, And so they are forcing their children to do, football, baseball, hockey, whatever it is. And they're pouring thousands and thousands of dollars into training and all that stuff. And it really doesn't have anything to do with getting a college scholarship or playing the pros. It's about dad trying to relive his failed athletic career. And of course, you can say the same thing for any kind of activity. That's, Carla last night was talking about dance mom, world, right? Where the dance moms are, almost abusing, their children when it comes to competition with dance. And I'm sure, you could probably find the same thing in music. You could probably find the same thing in all kinds of different things, right? Where the focus of athletics, the spirit of competition, all that kind of stuff, doesn't really matter to a lot of people. It's just about that ability to declare on Facebook or Instagram or whatever X, Y, or Z, right? And that's where some of the transgenderism in sports comes from. Like I said, is this desire to win at all costs, and also again the attention that comes from it. Leah Thomas, was the swimmer, right?
You wonder too if like the guy that was playing volleyball and spiking.
Oh yeah.
The girl in a concussion and she can't play anymore. But you wonder if there's not some aggression too behind it.
Oh yeah, there's some self-hatred. There's
maybe a hatred for women or something.
Yeah, well, there's certainly that going on too. And again,
Sick mind.
I don't want to downplay it. I also don't want to oversay it. But it really does just come back to simple, basic sin, right? That's, this lack of consideration for what God has made you to be, right? If God has made you to be a woman, what are you supposed to be?
Like Mr. Trump said last night in his speech,
God
made you the
the way that you are. Yeah, and that's part of the message that we need as a church needs to give to people struggling in this way is that and there does need to be some consideration for the fact that there are some sex things that are culturally constructed, right? Should women be on the front line of the military? No. Right. I had this conversation with the Coast Guard recruiter today. There's a reason why I won't let Mackenzie go in the Marines, the Army, or even the Navy, or even the Air Force, because what's the job of the U.S. military? Kill people, right? That's what the military is for, right? Is that necessarily where young ladies need to be? No. Now, do people go insane when you say things like that? Yes. Right? Now, does that mean women need to wear their pearls to go to Walmart? No. Right? Is it sin for women to wear pants? No. Right? Those are cultural constructs, right? But there are things that we should be careful to make sure that we teach our young boys and our young women that are native and natural and biblically founded. And is that going to put us at odds with the culture around us? Absolutely, right? There was a lot of wisdom in the old days where we had separate male schools and female schools, right? And what wisdom is there in that?
Learn to be a male.
Well, some of that, right? You learn things, but also,
competition maybe between the.
Yeah, one of the things, what's one of the problems that boys have in school?
They don't mature as fast.
They don't mature as fast as girls do. They don't learn in the same way girls do. Again, we're talking in generalities, but just me an example. What do you think I got in trouble for all the time when I was in school?
Talking.
Talking, and I wouldn't sit still. right?
In your sport.
Not well. That has nothing to do with male, female.
Looking out the window.
Yeah, right. And so you think of the way English boarding schools used to be set up, right? One of the things English boarding schools used to do every day is every single boy played a sport, and they would break in the middle of the day for practice. So they would have lessons in the morning. They would break and have practice for their sports during the middle of the day, and then they would go back to class afterwards. Now, you see the wisdom in that, right? Because, again, boys aren't as mature as girls, right? So they need to get that energy out, right? And, unfortunately, just because of the way things are, how are schools kind of geared nowadays? Who are they kind of geared for?
Athletes.
Well, yeah, especially at the college level. But generally speaking, the way we teach in the public schools is geared towards girls, right? It's kind of geared towards the way that girls learn. And so one of the things we've seen in the last 20 years is in college, right? What used to be the disparity. More boys in college than girls. Now what is it?
Girls.
It's completely flipped, right? You go to somewhere even like USC or Clemson, and you're talking 60-40 girls to boys, right? And obviously there has to be a way to figure out some kind of balance there. But, there's all kinds of issues related, again, to the transgender stuff that have to do with sex roles and with how we see men and how we see women, that affect a lot of this. But we could probably talk about this another 7 hours. But yeah, we'll talk about it some more because it is an important issue because it takes up a lot of our time, right? I mean, that's one of the things. How many people in the United States do you think are actually engaged in the transgender lifestyle?
1%.
Yeah, but the latest polling is 1.6% are actively engaged in transgender lifestyle.
Yeah, it's the spot.
Yeah. I mean, yeah.
It too is so disturbing.
Uh-huh.
I know even in some of the elementary schools or in Clover, the parents are supporting like the child, just a little elementary age, thinking they're, I don't know if it's male or female, but whatever is opposite of what they were born.
Right.
And they just think it's okay. Okay, the child wants to be a boy or the child wants to be a girl. So we're just gonna accept that and not try to find the child some mental help.
Yeah. I mean, because that's what it is. It's yeah. I mean, it's an issue.
Children